response to the crisis to blame for that death toll? And how much is the fault of US economic sanctions? Joining me now to discuss this from Tehran is this week's headliner, Sayed Mohammad Marandi, one of the country's most prominent political analysts and a professor at the University of Tehran. Mohammad Marandi, thank you for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you for having me.
You live in Tehran. You've watched this crisis unfold over the last few months. How bad is the situation there right now on the ground?
The situation now is actually a lot better. It's stabilized, and the numbers they do seem to be gradually decreasing. Initially, it was very difficult because the Iranians had big problems obtaining kits because of the U.S. sanctions. We had a shortage of kits. But gradually, the situation has become better. Iran has a very powerful, world-class primary healthcare network that it established in the 1980s and the 1990s. And it is carrying out, through that mechanism, active screening, both through the phone and online. So they've been able to contain the virus despite the many difficulties that were in the path of the healthcare network. It is forbidden for people to travel outside their provinces, so I can't travel outside of Tehran. Universities are closed. All my classes are online. Of course, not during the 2 weeks of vacation, but from Saturday, again, my classes will be back online. Parks are closed, cinemas are closed, and shops over the past few weeks are all closed.
A lot of people have rightly pointed out that US sanctions have exacerbated the crisis in Iran. They've prevented companies from delivering medical supplies, essential medications, equipment to deal with the crisis. Your foreign minister, Jawad Zarif, has accused the US of practicing, quote, medical terrorism against Iran. Is that a fair description, though, given the US would say humanitarian aid has always been exempt from their sanctions on Iran?
Well, no, the United States is lying, and I think everyone knows that. And those who say otherwise, they are guilty like those who are carrying out the policies. This is a crime against humanity. And they've weaponized the coronavirus for the Iranian people by prohibiting Iran from using the banking sector, by prohibiting Iran from purchasing goods from important pharmaceutical companies. The United States has put so many conditions on different pharmaceutical companies across the world that they will not work with Iran. They don't officially ban cooperation, but they put so many restrictions and so many threats that these companies have all told Iran, we can't work with you to deal with the crisis.
What about the new Swiss humanitarian trade agreement, the SHTA, which allows Switzerland and the Swiss banking system to act as a broker for international companies that want to deliver medical supplies or agricultural commodities or basic goods to Iran? It has US endorsement, approval, but the Iranians aren't using it. Why?
The Americans are good at propaganda, and the Western media, whether it's the corporate media or state media, they'll mimic what US government says when it comes to foreign policy. Just a few days ago, in an editorial, the New York Times had the audacity to claim that the sanctions had no impact on the situation in Iran. That's the degree of dishonesty, whether it's the liberals or whether it's the Republicans. It really doesn't make much of a difference.
Other Western governments have encouraged the Iranians to use. The Swiss are behind it, which is a neutral country. Why not use this essential humanitarian channel?
The Iranians have been using all available channels, and the Americans are trying to prevent Iran from exporting any goods. So it impoverishes the country that are necessary
but you
for
haven't
this war
dealt with my question,
as much
which
as
is the
possible.
Iranian government has not cooperated with the Swiss humanitarian trade agreement, which is there on the table.
I don't know about that mechanism, and you'd have to ask the Iranian government. I'm sure the Iranians have a very legitimate response to that. But I think it's quite clear that the Europeans have failed in their obligations within the framework of the nuclear deal. The Iranians have been pushing for this. Iran is not a poor country. Iran's assets have been stolen by the United States. And by the way, those governments that cooperate with the United States, whether it's the...
Hold on that subject, Mohammad Marandi, on the subject of Iran not being a poor country, that's a fair point. And a lot of European countries which sympathize with the Iranian predicament, a lot of people in the West who are condemning US economic sanctions on Iran, they also do point out, though, that when Iran does have spare cash, when it does have millions of dollars to spend, it spends a lot of those dollars on proxy wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Palestine. Why not use that money at home, they say, on your own people?
Come on, let's be serious here. The United States invaded Afghanistan from across the world. They invaded Iraq. They and their allies spent tens of billions of dollars destroying Syria, supporting extremists. You know that as well as I. You know about the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, and you had an interview with General Michael Flynn, who was the head of that.
I'm not here to re-argue the Syrian war. I'm asking, why not spend that money at home when you're saying that you're being crippled by U.S. sanctions? When you do have money, you spend it on military support for the Assad regime or the Houthi rebels or whatever it is.
You know that's nonsense. Iran spends money at home, and that's why Western countries have failed in the fight against the coronavirus, and we see the catastrophe taking place in the United States and Europe. And despite the sanctions, we've done much better. And we wouldn't have been in Syria.
Across the world, but
we would not have been in Syria. Iran
spends hundreds of dollars.
Let me respond. Yes, let me respond. If Iran hadn't entered Syria in 2013, the black flags would have been over Damascus as we speak right now. In Iraq, if Iran wasn't there to defend Baghdad, the city would have collapsed in the face of the same ISIS that the United States and regional countries, which you know quite well, allowed them to rise. And then we would have to fight. And
Mohammed Marandi, we've discussed these conflicts on the show many times before. I'm not here to re-argue Iraq or Syria, etc. I'm simply pointing out that, as you say, Iran is not a poor country. It does have funds, and it spends a lot of that money abroad. All I'm saying is, why not spend more of that money at home now you're in the middle of a crisis?
No, Iran does spend money at home. But if Iran hadn't prevented the fall of these countries, if Iran hadn't helped these governments and these countries and the people of Syria and Iraq to defend themselves against these extremists, we'd be fighting these extremists in Iran, and we'd have to pay a much greater price a day just to create stability in this country. Okay. So actually, if you want Iran to spend more money on its own people, then stop intervening in countries like Iraq. Stop intervening and destroying Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen.
Okay, so let me ask you this about people in Tehran. Clearly, U.S. sanctions have made things worse. But what about the Iranian government's actual response, which many would say also made the coronavirus crisis much worse, much more deadly for your country? For example, the deputy health minister at the outset publicly opposed quarantines. He said they were ancient, medieval things. And he said that while he was coughing and sweating at a press conference. I think the very next day he was tested positive himself for COVID-19. The Iranian government refused to shut down flights between China and Iran for weeks because it didn't want to wreck relations with the Chinese government. Iranian officials repeatedly played down the numbers of cases in Iran in places like Qom. You can't just blame U.S. sanctions for the situations in Iran right now. Surely there needs to be some recognition of serious government failures in Tehran too.
Come on, Mehdi. Iran got its first kit, I think, on February the 17th. And on February the 19th, they discovered their first case. And they declared it on the very same day. And the fight began since then. If you're talking about complacency, I don't know, do you mean the take it on the chin complacency of Boris Johnson, or it's going to magically disappear complacency of Donald Trump? But from day one, Iran was fighting the virus, and Western governments were...
I'm not here to defend Donald Trump or Boris Johnson.
People in the West were gloating.
But Mohammed Marandi, the deputy health minister, refused to quarantine the city of Qom, which was the worst hit city in Iran, over a month ago, saying quarantines are a thing of the past. Ayatollah Khamenei said, we've faced much graver crisis. People need to turn out for the elections. You had the president of a university in Mashhad saying, why didn't we stop the Chinese students coming in? Why not admit that the Iranian government botched part of its response to this crisis?
No, the Iranian government didn't botch the response. I'm not an advocate of the administration, but the Iranian government, as soon as it discovered what the problem was, it began to deal with it. But they didn't know the scope of the problem. It hit Iran far earlier than it hit Europe. And until very recently, the Europeans and the Americans were still debating what to do about it. The Iranians, with one hand tied behind their back, their assets stolen and frozen.
But you didn't shut down flights to China.
Being prevented from bringing in kits.
Back and forth from China. That was madness.
They did shut down flights from China. Actually, flights were still going to Europe after the Iranians stopped the flights. And with regards to quarantining Qom, the World Health Organization sent a team to Tehran. And the head of that team actually did an interview on international media, and they said that what Iran did was the right thing. The World Health Organization was opposed to a quarantine. They said it's not doable. And what was done in China, they said cannot be repeated in Iran and should not be repeated. So they actually said
you told me at the start of this
mechanism that the
interview
Iranians
that you have
were
shut
using
down
at
cities.
that time
That doesn't make
was
any
the appropriate
sense.
one.
Mohammed Marandi, you told me at the beginning of this interview that you now have shut down cities. You now can't go outside. You are doing classes from home. Why not do that a month ago, 6 weeks ago?
Mehdi, the situation evolved. The World Health Organization guidelines evolve and change. At that time, the World Health Organization team, which came to Iran and went to Qom and stayed in Qom with the Iranians, that was the decision that was made by the Iranians with the support of the World Health Organization. So if you want to criticize anyone, go criticize the World Health Organization.
One last question. One last question from me to you on Iran. Isn't the problem that for a long time, Iran has blamed the US for a lot of things, and on issues like the sanctions, they have a good argument. Yet a lot of the Iranian people are getting fed up with that answer as a justification for all of Iran's problems. Earlier this year, Iran, for example, blamed the US when the Revolutionary Guard shot down that Ukrainian civilian airline and tried to cover it up. Now it's the coronavirus. And again, you have Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, suggesting the US government might be behind the pandemic, seeming to endorse irresponsible conspiracy theories in a live address to the nation just a few days ago.
Nonsense, Mehdi, nonsense. There was no cover-up about the plane, and I think that's really disturbing that when the U.S. president threatens our country and threatens to obliterate it, he said that specifically, and threatens to strike cultural sites, the Iranian air defense was waiting for an American strike. It was tragic, but the blame lies on the Americans for threatening our country. With regards to conspiracy theories, Senator Cotton was the first person to talk about this. The Iranian leader never said that the Americans carried it out. The Chinese made a counterclaim, and the Iranians said, well, if the Americans can make the claims, then so can the Chinese. Let's hear them out.
Do you believe that the coronavirus is a U.S. chemical
attacks
weapon used against Iran, as Ayatollah Khamenei seems to suggest?
No, I've never said such a thing. He never said such a thing. He never said. He said that.
Why did he
basically said
that it might be?
Why did Senator Cotton say that the Chinese did it? Why did the Chinese government say the Americans were involved? Let's hear the evidence. That's their problem. When you go and speak of conspiracy theories that Iran was hiding this and Iran was hiding that, then the Chinese make these claims. Your claims are no more legitimate than Chinese claims simply because you live in the United States.
You just said
Chinese
you don't
have
agree
made a
with
claim.
the Chinese claim.
Let the Americans respond.
In a live address to the nation, it's a bit irresponsible to do that, no?
I don't know what was the origin of this virus, but I know that the regime in Washington has been using it as a weapon against Iranian. Don't blame the victim. That's ugly.
Mohammed Marandi, we'll have to leave it there. I hope you stay safe and indoors. Thank you for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just over a year ago, Tabata Amaral was a relatively unknown 25-year-old congresswoman in Brazil, but she became a household name in her country after a video of her critiquing the then conservative education minister went viral. Featured on a list of 100 rising stars by Time magazine, Amaral is now a force to be reckoned with in Brazilian politics, and that includes critiquing President Jair Bolsonaro's handling of the coronavirus. Brazil has now more cases of COVID-19 than any other country in Latin America, and the president there doesn't seem to really care. Tabata Amaral joins me now from Sao Paulo to discuss the situation in that country. Tabata Amaral, thank you for joining me on Upfront.
Hello, Mary. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You have around 7,000 cases, more than 200 deaths in your country. Those numbers have spiked this week. Your country's health minister says Brazil's healthcare system could be overwhelmed by the end of this coming month. Do you agree? Just how bad are things going to get in Brazil, do you think?
Well, besides all the numbers that you already brought, a lot of specialists in my country believe the numbers might be actually much bigger than that, because Brazil hasn't been able to test all of the people who need it. And besides all of this situation, and how profound of a crisis we are having right now, our president keeps going to television and going onto social media to spread fake news, to spread lies, and to say this is just a little crisis. And by doing those things and by telling people to go to the streets and actually going himself to meet the crowds, what he did last weekend, he's putting like lives in danger. And what I keep asking myself is, will he be held accountable? Will he making himself responsible for all of the deaths that might come from his responsibility? I don't think so.
He's saying some crazy stuff. He's referred to the coronavirus as a little flu, as hysteria, as a fantasy. He's accused the media and other politicians in Brazil, like yourself, of trying to trick Brazilians. He said he wouldn't worry if he got the virus because of his history as an athlete. He's railed against governors who've tried to take action and get people to stay at home. How much of a danger is he, not just to Brazil, but to the wider region?
Well, first, I'm very ashamed by all of the things he's doing, especially in moments of crisis such as this one. We need a leader who tells people everything will be all right. And he says he's doing those things because he's very worried about the economy. But all of the studies have shown that our health system doesn't have the capability to take all the people who need it if we don't flatten the curve. So what he's doing doesn't make any sense. He's actually forcing people to have access to food or taking the disease. What he should be doing, especially in a country as unequal as my country, was to provide some type of cash transfer so people could actually stay at home during this time of need.
And there have been very serious concerns that the president himself may have the virus. When he went to the US and met with Donald Trump and came back, more than 20 members of his delegation then tested positive for COVID-19. There were initial reports that the president himself had tested positive. One of them came from his own son. It was all later denied. Do you believe he's covering up his own condition, perhaps?
Well, he is not someone known for telling the truth, and he hasn't showed his test. So I think that's possible. But the bigger point is that he's being extremely responsible. We have 13 million people living in favelas in Brazil. Those people don't have access to infrastructure. Sometimes they don't have access to water. If they don't receive any help from the government, they will starve. They won't have anything to buy their foods. And the Congress has already approved this project that guarantees that for 3 months, people will have 600 reais per month, so they can actually stay at home and be safe. But the president and his government has been putting all types of difficulties. Always say, we don't have the money, we should protect the economy. But why are you protecting the economy if you are not taking care of the people in the first place?
Yes. You've called Bolsonaro's rhetoric not just irresponsible, but, quote, homicidal on the subject of the coronavirus. You've also said a president that forces people to choose between sickness and a plate of food doesn't deserve the office. Isn't the problem for you, though, Tabata Amaral, that he won a clear majority less than 18 months ago in a free and fair presidential election in Brazil? Nearly 60 million of your fellow Brazilians wanted him as their president. That's the reality.
Yes, and I know that our democracy is the thing we should value and protect the most. But our democracy has 3 powers because of that. Congress and the legislative is there to make sure that the president is being held accountable. And democracy puts in him a lot of limitations. When the president goes on national television, when he uses his social media to spread lies, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram have taken down things that our president wrote because they believed it meant a harm to the community. So that's the type of person we are talking about. I don't think when we say that the president is lying or when we try to protect the people, we are doing something undemocratic. No, I think it's the contrary. We are reminding him that he lives in a democracy and that our constitution puts a lot of limits on him to make sure that he's not using this power as being the president of our country to harm people. And when he tells people, go to the streets, come and meet me, oh, this is just a little flu, he's actually putting people in danger. And our constitution should be there to
support
save people's
calls
lives.
If he's putting people in danger? Would you support calls to impeach him? Because I believe polls now show that almost half the Brazilian public actually support impeaching and removing Bolsonaro from office. Is that something you support? Is that something you think is realistic even in the middle of this crisis?
I do think we have this conversation, and I do think he should be held accountable for everything he's doing, but after the crisis. I don't think my country can handle another crisis on top of coronavirus right now, because Congress is working just with computers from far away. And people are already very scared. Our economy is already very unstable. So as hard as it is to work with a president such as the one that we have, I do think we should try our best to protect people, to do what's necessary to combat coronavirus. But after all of this is over, I do think it might be the time for the country to have this type of conversation. Because what he's doing, I've never seen in our history.
So for a lot of our viewers watching around the globe who are familiar with President Donald Trump in the US and his kind of serial fabrications and his cover-ups and his unreliability and reckless leadership and ridiculous comments about the coronavirus, but are not so familiar with President Bolsonaro and what he said and done, how would you compare Bolsonaro and Trump? What are the similarities and differences?
So Bolsonaro says himself he's a big admirer of Trump, and especially in the beginning of the coronavirus, when it just hit Brazil, he would say that, oh, Trump said that, so why can't I do the same? But President Trump is more pragmatic. When he saw all of the people who are dying in the US, when he saw all of what that meant to his popularity, to the economy, he changed his attitude. And Bolsonaro is not changing the attitude. The hope I have is that no matter how many fake news he might spread in his social media, it doesn't matter how many lies he tells, facts will impose themselves. When people start losing loved ones because of the responsibility of our president, I don't think he'll support him anymore.
You have Bolsonaro at the top of the Brazilian political system causing havoc and chaos and not taking this seriously. But you also have many people in Brazil taking matters into their own hands. I believe the head of the Supreme Court and Bolsonaro's own health minister have repeatedly contradicted him on the threat posed by COVID-19. Governors have told residents to stay at home across Brazil. I believe one governor said, quote, do not follow the guidance of the president. And even in some favelas, even in some shanty towns, you have criminal and gang leaders imposing curfews to try and prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Are you heartened by Brazilians taking matters into their own hands? Is it enough to counter the damage being done from the top by Bolsonaro?
Well, what you said is true. We have most of his ministers, we have the Supreme Court, we have Congress, governors, mayors, who are taking an attitude that's completely different from President Bolsonaro. And we are doing a good job, like as a society. My state, São Paulo, has 70% of the deaths by coronavirus. And the governor you mentioned is the governor in my state. And what he's doing is actually saving lives because he has been able to flatten the curves. And ideologically, I don't agree to most of these people, but they are doing what's necessary. My point here is that this is such a huge crisis. The whole situation is so hard to everyone that when we have to, just spend so much energy with a president that tells people, go to the street, go and protest because you want to go out. And this is just a little flu. And he talks to millions of people who might hear him. It can be so frustrating that all of these people that we just mentioned are working so hard. I'm working so hard.
Yeah.
And you see the president on TV saying that. It just makes our effort have a smaller impact. But it doesn't matter that we won't work because of that. It's just that Bolsonaro is the biggest leader in our country, we like it or not. And people listen to what he's saying. So that's why what he says matters so much, and matters much more than what a specialist or what a governor might say, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, Tabata Amaral, thank you for joining me on Upfront. Stay safe. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
That's our show. In fact, that's the last episode of Upfront for this season. Upfront will be back later this year, hopefully from a studio. Good luck, stay safe, try and stay indoors. Goodbye.